Greetings and salutations, my dear readers. I suppose you might be wondering from the title why I would divulge such things to the masses. Well, because if I didn't, what would be the point, right? And besides, in such cases as this, disbelief is a powerful asset. But for the few of you willing to step into the world of the fantastical and listen to my words, I have much to tell. Please excuse the artistic embellishment, but I didn't get to where I am now by leaving well enough alone. For starters, I'm a craftsman, a bladesmith to be more specific, and a damn fine one at that. I cater only to those willing to pay top dollar for the very best. This detail is important and is the key in the focus of what I set out to accomplish, and accomplish I did. Now, as the title suggested, my goal was to actually create a cursed object. But how to even go about that, and why, you might ask? Well, the simple answer to how is it, by its very nature, cannot be easy. And why? Well, why not? I've never considered myself a nice or even good person, and I don't particularly value human life above any other. But I suppose you could say my motivation was that I was faced with the realization that, unlike those at the bottom with nowhere to go but up, I at the top of my craft had nowhere to go from there. I needed something that nobody else had ever done. So I began my year of painstaking research. The very first thing I set out to learn was what it is that makes something cursed or haunted. I came to the conclusion that it was trauma. Now, the nature and degree of the effect seemed to be the correlation to the type of trauma. Determining this was a vital step to my process, as there was a clear difference between a simple haunting and a genuine curse. You see, a haunting is, at its very core, the clinging of a soul, or will, or energy, or whatever you want to call it, to a place or object, usually through some form of tragic and untimely death. However, a curse is the result of a malicious and evil action, and therefore results in a much more potent connection. In addition, the worse the action, the greater the effect it has on the object. Once I established this, the next step was to identify, locate, and procure the various materials I would use in the construction. And not only the raw materials, but the tools as well. As part of my method, I decided that as many of the tools I would use as possible would also need to possess these malevolent histories. I took to the internet and frequented any and every site I could find that focused on violent murders. And not the run-of-the-mill murders either. No, sir. I was looking for very specific instances in which some element of the murder was both usable in my project and actually obtainable. It is at this point that I should mention that if you have any inclination to replicate my endeavor, you should be prepared to spend a great deal of money on both travel and procurement of these materials, especially when the situation calls for you to bribe an evidence room guard or two. Their compliance in silence doesn't come cheap, and is often the only way to obtain certain items. As I am a bladesmith, the obvious choice for this undertaking was to make the object some kind of large knife or small sword. So the first and most important item on the list was the steel for the blade. Finding a piece of steel with the right composition to make a half-decent cutting tool is easy enough, mind you. However, the difficulty arose in meeting the project-specific qualities I required for this unique piece. But after searching, I happened upon a particularly enticing case of a man in the Pacific Northwest who was convicted of multiple homicides and sexual assault charges. The case involves repeated instances of the man luring young women out of the public sight, rendering them unconscious, placing them in his van, then driving them far away to an abandoned lumberyard. It was here that he would assault the women for periods of time ranging from days to weeks before executing them by placing them on the conveyor belt feet first with their legs tied and crossed together, and sending them into the running saw blade. It seems as if he got great satisfaction from watching them shriek and cry as the screaming saw made contact with the bottom of their feet, then moving up through their crossed legs, their torso, and finally their head. In the end, he was charged and convicted of 11 counts of murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, and various lesser charges. However, after the trial, he confessed to anywhere from 35 to 45 additional counts that remain uncorroborated due to him allegedly disposing of the remains in an industrial wood chipper he kept on the site. The case was perfect, and the location of the sawmill was relatively easy to find. Upon my arrival, I found that the local authorities had sealed off the entrance, but that was a contingency I had planned for, and was able to overcome with bolt cutters I had purchased at a small hardware store earlier that day. As I made my way into the mill, I began my search for the saw, immediately apprehensive that the saw he used might be a band saw, which would be much less practical for my needs, not to mention considerably harder to move and transport. But after a brief period of searching, there it sat, a beautiful 30-inch circular saw blade. As I drew closer, it became apparent by the deep and stained surroundings of the fixture that this was the blade I was looking for. Reaching to the small tool bag I brought from the rented U-Haul truck outside, I made quick work of removing the large disc from its fixture, with the help of a little WD-40 to loosen the years of rust that clung to the treads. After rolling the saw blade the short distance back to the truck and loading it into the cargo hold, I began plotting my next acquisition. This would be the remains of a recent homicide by arson a few states down. This case involved several teenagers burning down another child's home that they had been bullying. After took refuge for them in his house, after fleeing their attempts at inflicting upon him whatever form of harm they were planning that day. As it turned out, the boy's slightly younger sister was in the dwelling at the time as well, and they suffered the same fate together. Awful tragedy for them and their parents. Happy coincidences for me and my little project. I would use the charred remains as the fuel for the fire in which I would forge the blade. This was a relatively unchallenging, albeit tedious and tiresome task that would involve shoveling the blackened wood into burlap sacks and chucking them into the back of the truck. I'll admit I felt a cold chill run down my back from time to time during this chore. The energy that was still very fresh and strong, which is why I was so intent on harvesting that one in particular. Once done, I took to a local diner and began locating the next stop. I would need something for the handle, so I looked for murders involving something that could serve such a purpose. I first found one such case where a teenage girl became mentally disturbed and beat the child she had been babysitting to death with a wooden softball bat, then waited for the parents to return and did the same to them. Unfortunately, the murder weapon was never actually recovered. What a shame, I thought to myself, and went on about my research. About an hour later, I found a case about a man who used an axe handle to kill his wife, and the man he caught her having an affair with. However, that didn't quite seem sinister enough, so I searched until... jackpot. I couldn't believe my luck when I stumbled across an article about a case involving a middle-aged woman who had lured several young children into her home where she tortured them, killed them, and butchered them, before cooking and eating their remains. To my fortune, I was able to learn that the local boutique dealing in the macabre had come into possession of the cutting board she used. Before making the trip to investigate the authenticity of the cutting board, I did some more digging to see if there was any more usable memorabilia between my location and the destination. After a few dead ends, I stumbled upon a case of a man murdering his then pregnant wife with a gas-powered nail gun by firing more than 16 nails into her head and face, but not before doing the same to her stomach. The nails would make perfect pins for the handle, I spoke to myself quietly. But not quietly enough to keep the man in the booth in front of me from giving me a nosy glance back over his shoulder. And as luck would have it, the incident took place roughly 2/3 the way between where I was and where I was headed. The only issue was that, to the best of my knowledge, the nails were still in the possession of the local police department, as the man was still waiting trial. Obtaining these wouldn't be as simple as the rest, and most assuredly not as cheap. But this wasn't an opportunity I was going to let pass me by. I departed the following morning and arrived at my destination some 8 or so hours later. The next week was spent figuring out exactly which member of the department would be most susceptible to my bribe. I settled on a middle-aged fellow we'll call Carl. Carl was a police property clerk and had accumulated some hefty gambling debts. After faking a casual conversation when I coincidentally ran into him at the local dive bar, that I then carefully steered towards our jobs in order to cover my knowledge of his, I lied that I was a building contractor. Then I moved the conversation to our hobbies, which I again lied and told him I liked to collect weird and creepy items, and finally to our personal problems once his intoxication had reached sufficient levels. Once he mentioned that he had some substantial outstanding debts with not-so-gentle types, I suggested a possible solution to his tribulations. If you can get me a couple of those murder nails out of evidence, I can make all your financial troubles disappear, I offered, and even grease the wheels with a little extra for your efforts in silence. Just for 2 little nails that nobody would really even miss. One from the woman's head and one from her stomach. And your debt will be free and even a little richer on top of that. What do you say? I pressured.
Oh dear God, man. How would anybody in their right mind even want such a thing?
He asked with utter revulsion. My business is my own. I want those 2 nails, and after that, you'll have your money and I'll be long gone. Last chance. By noon the next day, I had the nails in my hand, still crusted in the dull brown of dried blood. I quickly tucked them away into a small pouch, which I stashed in the back of the truck with everything else before setting out to my next destination. It's worth mentioning that at this junction I began to feel a constant sense of unease whilst the truck, accompanied by an ever-present sensation of wearing an extremely tight-fitting shirt that made me uncomfortable and somewhat asphyxiated as I drove, even after putting on the loosest clothing I had packed. I managed to arrive at the boutique just before closing. The shopkeeper welcomed me casually as I passed through the door, causing a small bell to herald my entry. I wasted no time in telling him what I was there for. A grim expression washed over his face, but was in short order replaced by one of what seemed to be relief. $20 and it's yours. That damn thing gives me some serious bad vibes and I want it out of here. Should never bought the thing. Horrible the ordeal was. This gave me some confidence that it was a genuine article, but I still had to compare it to the crime scene photos just to be sure. He went into the back of the shop and returned soon after carrying a bundle of scarlet fabric, which he proceeded to unravel to reveal the deep black ebony cutting board. I thought to myself that a lady with such refined taste would have made a fine customer in another life, and no sooner did the thought enter my brain, the shopkeeper spoke up.
I've got her kitchen knife set too, actually, if you want those too. They're actually pretty nice.
Curiosity took me, and I'd said I'd consider it, if only to see what kind of cutlery one who owned such a lovely and expensive cutting board would have. He made his way into the back once more and retrieved the knife block. Before I could catch myself, I was laughing maniacally in the middle of the shop, now a look of confusion on the shopkeeper's face. In my search for the cutting board, it never seemed to occur to me to investigate what other tools the lady might have used in her crimes. And to my great surprise, I immediately recognized the set of knives as my very own work. The coincidence was too much, and the laughter erupted out of my control. I knew for a fact she was no customer of mine. She must have obtained them second-hand, maybe from an estate sale or as a gift. But they were definitely and unmistakably of my make. Is there a problem? The shopkeeper asked through my laughter. No, not at all. Just a very small world we live in, I replied and calmed myself down to a reasonable state. I guess I'll take those off your hands as well. I added, since I got such a good deal on the cutting board, I figured I could buy the knife set from him too, as a small token of my appreciation. How much? I inquired.
Take $100 for all of them,
he answered. An unexpected anger took me as I growled, $100? His eyes widened in shock.
I'm sorry, mister. I thought that was a fair price since they're so pretty, but I can go a little lower if you think that's too much.
I glared at him for a moment before barking. No, that's fine. Here. Handing him the total for everything. I collected my purchases together and opened the door with a sharp kick, causing the bell to clang in alarm as I looked down at the set of kitchen knives I once charged thousands of dollars for, seething over the thought of them being hawked away for $100 goddamn at this ruddy little hole-in-the-wall junk shop. Once my temper subsided, I got back to my wicked little scavenger hunt. I happened across a 2-pound hammer a man used to bludgeon his elderly and disabled parents to death. I would have to repeat my nails con to get my hands on it, but I knew it would be perfect for forging the blades out of, so I had to have it. The narrative of obtaining the hammer was, for all intents and purposes, an encore of the acquisition of the nails. There's always someone who needs money, and they're always willing to compromise their self for enough of it. At this point, I was beginning to feel physically ill during the time I spent in the truck with the collection of items, so I elected to abandon my previous idea to accumulate any more tools to simply use my own instead. I made only one unscheduled stop on my return trip. As I began to make my way back down onto the interstate, I was stopped by a red light. It was there in the dark and early morning hours that I witnessed from my seat in the rented truck what appeared to be 2 homeless men struggling against one another beneath the overpass. I sat in morbid fascination for several minutes at the empty intersection, watching the 2 do battle until one seemed to wrap a length of cord around the other's neck and proceed to strangle the life out of him. I popped the door of the truck open and made my way across the street. The triumphant vagabond jumped, startled by my presence and the realization that I witnessed the incident.
It was self-defense,
he started, but I cut him off with a gesture of my hand. Reaching down, I untangled the long piece of nylon cord from the dead man's lifeless body. I ran it through my fingers, taking note of the size, thickness, and length, finding this to be an acceptable addition to the final product, which I would wrap around the handle. I rolled it up as I made my way back to the vehicle I had left sitting abandoned at the still desolate traffic light. I opened the back once again, and after finding a place for the newest addition, I departed towards my workshop.